You have felt it at the pump, at the checkout line, in the price tag that keeps climbing no matter what your local economy is doing. That feeling is not paranoia. It is structural, and it has a name. Every barrel of oil you have ever paid for was priced in a currency issued by a government that may have never touched that oil. Every ton of wheat, every ounce of copper, every container shipped out of a port in Rotterdam or Busan, priced the same way. Not in the currency of the buyer. Not in the currency of the seller. In the currency of a third country that simply prints it. That country is the United States, and the mechanism is not a conspiracy. It is a design choice made in 1944, defended for 8 decades, and rarely explained to the people who live inside its consequences. Here is the pattern you have already noticed. Inflation in your country tracks decisions made by a central bank you don't vote for. Here is what economists call it: dollar dominance, sometimes exorbitant privilege. Here is the last time this system nearly broke, 1971, when Washington unilaterally severed the dollar from gold and the rest of the world had no vote in the matter. And here is what it tells you about the present moment. The architecture built in 1944 still prices your groceries. The real axis, the competing explanation you usually hear, is simpler than the truth. Inflation, you're told, is a domestic story: supply chains, corporate greed, local monetary policy. Each of those plays a role. None of them explains why a coffee farmer in Colombia, a wheat importer in Egypt, and a chipmaker in Taiwan are all watching the same number on the same afternoon. The target rate set by the Federal Reserve in Washington. The real axis of global pricing is not supply and demand in the abstract. It is currency invoicing, the decision made trade by trade of which currency a contract is written in. And the overwhelming majority of global trade, even trade that never touches American soil, is written in dollars. Site index equals 0-1. Barry Eichengreen's 2011 book Exorbitant Privilege examines how the dollar became the world's dominant reserve currency and what that has meant for the United States and the global economy. /site, his finding, stated plainly. The dollar's dominance is not primarily about the size of the American economy. It is about infrastructure, the depth of U.S. Treasury markets, the reach of the SWIFT payment system, and 8 decades of institutional habit that no rival currency has matched. Once a commodity market picks a pricing currency, it rarely switches. Oil has been priced in dollars since the 1970s. It still is. Bretton Woods, 1944. Consider July 1944, a hotel in New Hampshire, 44 Allied nations negotiating the postwar monetary order. John Maynard Keynes arrived with a proposal, a neutral international reserve unit, which he called bancor, designed so that no single nation's currency would sit at the center of world trade. Washington rejected it. The American delegation, led by Harry Dexter White, insisted instead that the dollar, convertible to gold at a fixed rate, become the anchor of the entire postwar system. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. The dollar alone would be pegged to gold. You are watching, in that negotiating room, the moment the rest of the 20th century's pricing architecture gets decided. Keynes lost. The dollar won. And the world has been invoicing itself in the winner's currency ever since. The Triffin Dilemma. The system built at Bretton Woods carried a flaw that a Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin identified in congressional testimony in 1960, years before it broke the system it described. Site index equals 1-1. Triffin argued that a country whose currency serves as the world's primary reserve currency faces a fundamental conflict. It must run persistent trade deficits to supply the world with enough currency for reserves and trade, but those same deficits eventually undermine confidence in the currency's value. /site, this is not abstract. It means the United States must send more dollars out into the world than it takes back in, indefinitely, simply to keep global trade liquid. And that structural deficit is precisely what critics point to when they warn about the dollar's long-term stability. Here is the short version. The world needs dollars to trade. Supplying them requires deficits. Deficits erode the currency they're meant to support. Triffin named the trap in 1960. Nixon confirmed it in 1971, when he closed the gold window because foreign governments were redeeming dollars for gold faster than Fort Knox could sustain. The peg broke. The privilege did not. Why the privilege survived the peg. This is the part rarely explained on the news. Floating exchange rates should have ended dollar dominance. Instead, dollar dominance adapted. In the years after 1971, Washington negotiated a new arrangement with Saudi Arabia, oil sold exclusively in dollars, with the proceeds substantially recycled into U.S. Treasury securities. Analysts call this the petrodollar system. It meant that even without a gold peg, every nation needing oil needed dollars first. The dollar's anchor shifted from a metal in a vault to a commodity in the ground. You can see the mechanism in a single transaction. A refinery in Japan buys crude from a producer in the Gulf. Neither side uses the yen. Neither side uses the rial. Both convert to dollars, complete the trade, and the dollars that leave Japan's central bank often return to the United States as purchases of treasury debt. That round trip, dollars out for oil, dollars back for bonds, is not incidental. It is the load-bearing wall of the modern system. Myth: a strong dollar only helps America. Myth: dollar dominance is a story about pure American advantage, a lever Washington pulls at will. Reality: it is a double-edged structure. When the Federal Reserve raises rates to fight domestic inflation, it does not just tighten credit in Ohio. It tightens dollar liquidity for every emerging market government that borrowed in dollars, because their debt service costs rise even though their local currency didn't move. Why it's false? Countries from Argentina to Sri Lanka have faced debt crises, not because they mismanaged their own currency, but because a decision made in Washington, for domestic American reasons, made their dollar-denominated debt suddenly more expensive to service. The privilege exports American monetary policy to the entire planet, whether or not the planet consented. The 1980s debt crisis. You do not need to guess whether this has happened before. In 1979, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised the federal funds rate above 19% to break domestic inflation. The immediate effect inside the United States was a recession. The delayed effect outside the United States was catastrophic. Mexico, Brazil, and a dozen other dollar-indebted nations found their debt service costs had roughly doubled overnight, triggering the Latin American debt crisis of 1982, a decade of stagnation across the region that economists still call the lost decade. Volcker was not targeting Mexico. He didn't have to. The dollar's centrality did the targeting for him. That is the pattern again, dressed in different clothes. A domestic decision, an involuntary global consequence, and a currency structure that makes the consequence automatic rather than negotiated. The deeper question, the one most coverage never reaches, is why alternatives keep failing. The euro was designed, in part, as a genuine rival reserve currency. It has not displaced the dollar. The Chinese yuan, backed by the world's second-largest economy, accounts for a small single-digit share of global reserves despite years of deliberate promotion by Beijing. Site index equals 2-0. Michael Pettis, in his analysis of global trade imbalances, has argued that a currency's reserve status depends less on the size of its issuing economy than on whether that economy is willing to run the persistent deficits in open capital markets required to supply the world with its currency. Site China has been unwilling to do this. Its capital controls remain tight, its bond markets remain comparatively closed, and both are deliberate policy choices, not accidents. A reserve currency requires the issuing government to accept a version of the Triffin Dilemma. Beijing has, so far, declined the trade. 2008 and the global dollar shortage. Consider September 2008. Lehman Brothers collapses in New York. The immediate assumption, in most coverage at the time, was that this was an American banking crisis with global spillover. Site index equals 3-2. Adam Tooze's 2018 account, crashed, reframes the event. The deepest danger was not the failure of American banks but a sudden, worldwide shortage of dollars, as European banks that had financed themselves in dollar markets found that financing evaporating overnight. Site, the Federal Reserve, not any international body, ended up extending emergency dollar swap lines to central banks from London to Tokyo to keep the global financial system liquid. The lender of last resort for the entire world, in the worst financial crisis in 70 years, turned out to be a single national institution answerable to a single national government. You are watching the clearest possible demonstration of what dollar dominance means in practice. It is not a policy that Washington imposes. It is a dependency the rest of the world built, one contract at a time over decades, and in a crisis, everyone discovers how deep that dependency runs. Myth: sanctions prove the system is breaking. Myth: the extensive use of dollar-based financial sanctions against Russia after 2022 proves the system is collapsing, that nations are fleeing the dollar in response. Reality: the data on reserve composition shows only gradual, marginal diversification, not flight. Why it's false: the infrastructure that makes the dollar useful, deep bond markets, near-universal invoicing habits, decades of contractual inertia, cannot be replaced by political anger alone. A country can resent the dollar's centrality and still have no functioning alternative for pricing its oil exports next Tuesday. Watch which currency a commodity is invoiced in. Oil, wheat, and most industrial metals remain dollar-priced, which means a strong dollar makes them more expensive everywhere at once, regardless of local supply. 3. Notice emerging market debt crises in pairs. They rarely happen in isolation, because they usually share a single upstream cause: tightening dollar liquidity. 4. Read reserve composition reports from the IMF's COFR data, not headlines claiming imminent de-dollarization. The actual pace of diversification is measured in single-digit percentage points per decade. 5. Distinguish sanctions-driven diversification from organic currency competition. The former is defensive hedging by a handful of states, not a market-wide shift in trust. 6. Pay attention to swapline announcements during crises. When the Federal Reserve extends dollar liquidity to foreign central banks, it is quietly confirming who the system's actual lender of last resort remains. 7. Understand that a strong dollar and strong American economy are not synonyms. Dollar strength driven by rate differentials can coexist with, and even worsen, stress abroad. This is not a story about villains. It is a story about architecture built in 1944, defended in 1971, weaponized in 2022, and still standing. No single actor designed every consequence you feel at the checkout line. The structure produces them on its own, automatically, the way a load-bearing wall holds weight whether or not anyone remembers it's there. You have been pricing your life in a language written by someone else's central bank. Now you know why. That is not a reason for alarm. It is a reason for literacy, because the next crisis, wherever it starts, will very likely arrive through the same channel this one did. If this reframed how you're reading the price tags in front of you, the next video maps a dynamic in the South China Sea that almost no mainstream coverage has explained correctly. The actual strategic logic behind why a handful of reefs matter more than most countries' entire GDP. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.